Hi, students. Welcome to second recorded lecture. This one is on political geography, and let's just jump right in. So, what we're seeing here, what we're looking at, of course, is a map, right, of the United States, particularly of the states and their borders. So you can see here pictured are the 50 states, including Alaska and Hawaii, and U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, Northern Marianas, U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, etc. Right? And of course, they can't all fit. This isn't a realistic representation of where these states and territories are located, particularly the Alaska, Hawaii. However, right, the state borders represented here are pretty accurate in terms of what they look like, right, their shape. And you might be wondering, how exactly do the states get their borders, right? And this is an important thing to understand the United States, its shape, right, and why certain states occupy certain territory while others don't, right? And where there might be even in some instances conflicts between states about where their border ends or begins. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So to start off, the 16 states on the East Coast, right? The original 13 colonies, plus like Vermont, West Virginia, and Florida, right? Including Alaska, which was not originally a U.S. territory, right? Um, all of these lines, the lines for these states were established by European countries first, and they were given borders based on a very limited knowledge of local geography. Over time, though, with political disputes, right, which went from court cases to wars, these 17 states then modified their borders until we have what you see today. Right, so we're looking right now, of course, at the east coast of the United States, right? And then we have places like Texas, Hawaii, and California, which were all technically independent, right, before they were part of the United States to a varying degree, right? Hawaii was a kingdom, it had its own government before it became U.S. territory and later a state. Texas also was kind of an technically independent country, right, before it became part of the United States. Prior to that, it had been Spanish territory, right? Then Mexican. Um, and those three entered the Union, right? Or became part of the United States through negotiations where they got to keep most of their land and much of the same land that they controlled before becoming a U.S. state. And this is why they are so different, right? From other states. Um, Most of the rest of the U.S. territory was carved out. There was territory that the U.S. controlled at the time of independence. So we're talking about 1776, right? So again, the original colonies. And then much of which it acquired through purchase, like the Louisiana Purchase, which I discussed in a class, right? Particularly when we talked about indigenous geographies, and that occurs in 1830, where the U.S. purchases uh, territory west of the Mississippi River, which is a sort of a natural border, right? And begins its westward expansion right after 1830. Most of these states, prior to becoming U.S. states, were populated mainly by Indians, right, or indigenous Americans before being acquired by the United States. So because now to understand like the composition, right, you have to think that these borders also came to be and changed over time, right? Both through negotiation, through policy decisions, right? Through acts of Congress, etc. And a lot of these borders were actually also based on the natural landscape, right? So there are places where the Mississippi River acts as a natural border. There are other places where other waterways or mountain ranges act as a natural border, right? And then surveyors, who are the people who like look at land and then decide where to draw these imaginary lines or these symbolic lines that separate one state from another, right? Decided where one state should end and another should begin. So again, this is a process of creation, right? They weren't naturally so. Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa didn't just exist, right? They came to be because they were formed and they were given this shape on the map, right? Through policy, through war, through acts of Congress, etc. Now, let's jump in a little bit on what we're talking about when we talk about political geography, right? So the first term we want to understand is what do we mean when we say politics or political, right? So politics really is this idea or the art or science of governing, right? So to practice politics, right, is to think about and apply different ways of organizing society through a form of government, right? Um, Political, right, usually refers to action or a practice of politics, right? So when we say words like political affairs or political life, right, we're talking about sort of the application of policy or the application of guiding and influencing and uh, carrying on government in a certain way, right? The same you'd say about political opinions. We all might have different or differing political opinions about how we believe government or society should be managed, administrated, right? Um, so first understand that, right? What are we talking about when we talk about politics? And politics in terms of the origin of the word, right? Um, is comes from the Greeks, right? It comes from politiques, right? Or and particularly from the title of Aristotle's Politics, right? Which of spiritual or secular governance, political, right? So the same concept is there, right? It's this idea of uh, forming a form of governing, right? That's what we talk about when we talk about politics. So when you say, for example, Republican or Democratic politics, right, it's because those two parties, right, have different visions of how government should be run, right, and how what kind of influence government should have over society. Political, right, is of relating to government or a government or the conduct of government, right, or of relating to or concerned with the making as distinguished from the administration of governmental policy, right? So a political act, for example, right, is to pass legislation, right? A political act is to do something in the interest of pushing or influencing government, right, and how we govern. So, what are we talking about when we talk about political geography? Well, political geography is the study of how politics affects, right, space. How do political decisions, how do political events, political acts influence, uh, for example, in this instance, right, the borders of a state or of a city, where a city ends, where a county ends, where it begins. Um, but also where things in that organ within that organization, right, within that state, within that county, within that town are going to be located. All of this happens usually through some form of political decision or another, right? So it's the study of how politics affect the spatial order, right? And how the spatial order also informs politics. So how does the landscape, how does the built environment and the natural environment influence political decisions or politics, right? Um, so the study of political events, for example, like a presidential election, a coup d'etat, like an overthrow of a government, right, or a civil war, if you were taking on a political geography perspective of studying that event, your focus would be on the spatial organization inherent to them and to the power relationships that underpin them, right? So you'd be thinking about how did this happen within the space? What kind of spatial um, in this case, organization, the setting up, right, of the events and of the location, right, how that played a role in how these events happened and were carried out, right? But also what kind of power dynamics, what kind of between two opposing or more opposing parties took place, right, in that location. So traditionally, political geographers, for example, used to look at really focused on the idea of the state as the key unit of analysis, right? So the state being not just a state as in the United States, but like the state as a government, right? As a form of government. Today, political geographers look or have broadened, right? Their unit of analysis also look at big P and small p politics. When we say big P politics, we're talking about states and their relations with other states or a group of states. So, for example, big P politics would be electoral politics, geopolitics, right? Geopolitics refers to um, the relationships between states around the world, right? So, for example, the relationship between France and the United States or the United States and the United Kingdom. Small p politics refers to politics by non-state actors who work through social movements. So we're talking about civil society, right? So me and you, student organizations, labor unions, teachers unions, social movements, right? Like the LGBTQ liberation movement or the pro-immigration movement, etc., right? And the idea there is that when we say non-state actors, that these are people that don't represent officially in any official capacity the state government, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about small p politics. So here's an example of political geography at work, right? Someone here, in this case for the Census Bureau, right, has divided up the United States and the states within it into these different regions and divisions to be able to, in this case, right, map, but also organize data, in this case, census data, right? When we do population counts, right? And where people live, how many people live, what do they do for employment, what are their demographic makeup, female, male, age groups, right? Race, ethnicity, languages spoken, etc. Have, for convenience, divided up, right, the United States into these regions and divisions, right? So exemplified here, right, is the West, the Midwest, the Northeast, the South, right? And the idea here, right, is that we do these things to sort of simplify the work and then say, for example, okay, for the Northeast region, we found out that the majority population is made up of so and so, right? For the Midwest, the same. For the West, the same. The South, etc., right? That's why we create these regions and divisions, which are symbolic, right? But have a practical use, in this case, for the study of the population of the United States. So, some of the key concepts in political geography that we have to take into account and that are very important because they play a significant role in this idea of politics and how to govern, right? So, one is citizenship, right? Um, Citizenship is the form of spatial belonging, right? It's a legal relationship that we have with a state. Um, in where we have both rights and responsibilities, which are laid out in the laws and constitutions of the state. We as New Yorkers, right, have certain rights as residents of New York State, but we also have rights as residents or citizens, right, of the United States as a totality, right? So we have rights derived from both the federal government and from the state, and we have responsibilities to both. For example, we pay taxes both to the federal government and to the state, but we also get to vote and participate in politics and in decision making, both at the federal level and at the state level, right? That's what citizenship grants us. It also grants a certain degree of protection, right, from having our individual civil rights violated, for example, by the state, right, whether it's New York or by the federal government. And the state, meaning this case, the government, right, regulates the conditions under which one is a citizen, and where it belongs, right? How a citizen, who gets to be a citizen and who doesn't, right? And the idea of citizenship is not neutral, it's not universal. It is often granted in a very uneven manner, right? Some cases to those who can afford it or who meet certain criteria, right? And it has often been historically entangled with the creation of certain discriminatory categories like race, uh, sex, right, ethnicity, etc. And I mean that from on a global perspective, right? Not just the United States. Now, the United States has a really important policy that a lot of countries do not have, which is jus soli, which is birthright citizenship, right? If you are born in the United States, no matter where your family is from, no matter their legal status, you are granted citizenship. You become a citizen of the United States if you are born in United States territory. Another key concept, and we discussed this early on in the course, right, is this idea of nation, right? Because we talk about nation. Now, this definition of nation here from Benedict Anderson, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to understand, right, when we say nation, we're talking about an idea. We're talking about an imagined community, an imagined political community, right? That's why I prefer the term country, like a country, like the United States is a country. It's hard to call it a nation because when we say nation, we're talking about a group of people, right, that have, again, this imagined sense of shared belonging, right? And that may be the case for a lot of people in the United States, but it may not necessarily represent everyone who lives in the United States, if that makes any sense, right? So the nation is an imagined community because regardless of um, most of us will never know everybody who that we share this idea of nation with the United States, right? Will never be equal in every way, right? But we all believe, or some of us believe, right, that we belong to this nation, right, that has shared cultural history, shared language, right, and also that has a limited projection to who can be part of that nation and also sovereignty over a territory, right? Another key term is the state, right? And this is basically it's almost exchangeable for a form of government, right? But the state is a form of human association distinguished from other social groups by its purpose, right? The establishment of order and security. Its methods are the laws and their enforcement, its territory, the area of jurisdiction or geographic boundaries, and finally by its sovereignty, right? Um, so the state, right? When we're talking about the state, we're really getting into sort of the main subject around the form of organization. We're talking about sort of a political organization, right? Because it involves politics and policies to be able to bring together this human association, right, and establish a form of order um, that we then regulate, right? And the idea of the nation state, again, mentioned this early on in the course, right, is an unrealized idea. It's an ideal form, right, where people think of the aspiration of the nation state as this idea of a government where everybody shares the same history, the same culture, the same language, the same art, the same narrative around ethnicity. But historically, right, there's very few countries in the world where you could say that the people that live within it only encompass one national group, right? That's very rare. So another key concept is sovereignty. Sovereignty, the sovereign, right, means the right to rule over a territorially bound state without external interference. This right to rule can only be exercised if there is a sovereign. That's the entity that exercises that power to rule, right? It also is very important that that sovereign, right, that authority has to be recognized both internally, so by the people who live within that territory, right, and also externally by other states outside of the territorial boundaries that recognize you, right? Recognize your state and your sovereignty. Today, the right to exercise sovereignty over a bounded territory is recognized internationally by the United Nations. So, pretty much every country in the world that formally exists, right, with its own flag, with its own national anthem, etc., right, um, is recognized internationally by the United Nations. And that is the process through which basically a country gains this right to sovereignty, which means that another neighboring state or another neighboring country cannot simply invade it or claim their territory as theirs, right? Because you have this right to sovereignty. This is also what allows states to enforce laws like immigration laws, for example, right, to restrict who can enter, right, the country, who can remain in the country, who can claim the right of citizenship in that country. Another very important term is territory, right? And when we say territory, we're talking about a portion of the Earth's surface that is claimed by or associated with a particular group or political entity, right? So a state claims a piece of land, a territory. When we looked at that map of the United States with, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Washington, Oregon, Mississippi, etc., right? Um, each state has a defined territory that then is um, enclosed by these symbolic borders, right? An international law defines state territory as the land claimed by the state and that is recognized as such by other, including the subsoil, meaning underground, right? So for mineral rights. And also it's internal, so the rivers, lakes, and also adjacent waters like ocean, parts of the ocean, right? So there's this, well, I'll explain that in a little bit. So there's most countries, right, have this right to a certain amount of nautical miles from their coasts, right? And that's what's pictured here. The United States, for example, has this exclusive economic zone or EEZ. Most countries are granted these EEZs by United Nations, right? In this case, the United States, right? Exclusive economic zone extends 200 nautical miles from the territorial sea baseline, including the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and any other territory or possession over which the United States exercises sovereignty. So these blue outlines in the map, right? Those are the EEZ or those are the exclusive economic zones granted to the United States by the international community or by international law, right? Now, within each of these blue areas, right, or these exclusive economic zones, the United States has sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing natural resources. So this is where the United States, for example, has the right to, let's see, if a fishing boat came from and the fishing boat had a Dutch flag, right? The United States can technically kick them out or grant them permission to fish in the area, right? That means having sovereignty, having control, right? This also means that this is where the United States can extract fish and seafood, right? Where it can look for oil, where it can look for minerals, right? Um, and has exclusive rights to that, right? In these blue zones. But so territories can be contested, right? And they're not always that set in stone, right? So, for example, to give you an example of, and there are multiple parts of the United States where states, for example, contest territory, right? Where one state says, no, this land belongs to me, and the other neighboring state says, no, it belongs to me. But here's one example, right? And the interesting one because this is between New Jersey and New York, right? And this stems from a court case that where so let's go back to the so in in 1834, Congress approves this compact or this treaty between New Jersey and New York that gives all of the above water land, right? So the land above sea level, right? Of the original 3 acre island to New York. In this case, we're talking about Ellis Island. Famously, Ellis Island, right, is the stop where uh, international immigrants would arrive when and would be processed when arriving into the United States, particularly in the 19th and early part of the 20th century, historically, right? Because people traveled by boat before there was air travel, right? So in 1890, right, the government begins to expand the size of the island tenfold over the next 40 years. So you can see here the top image, right? This is the original Ellis Island and Fort Gibson in 1819. Then, which is technically part of New Jersey. It's New Jersey territory, right? Even though it's in the water. But the government, right, begins to build over this small island and expand it in size, right? And so, oh, I'm sorry about that. So New Jersey begins to contest um, this territory, right? Um, and contends that the artificial portions of the island built on top of the previously submerged lands, right? This are the original Ellis Island and Fort Gibson, um, were technically also part of New Jersey. New York, in turn, argued that the whole island, including the expanded parts, were part of New York. So, staff from the Department of Environmental Protection, Bureau of Tidelands, Geographic Information Systems, or GIS unit, and Land Use Regulation Program then did the work of proving New Jersey's claim, right? So they gathered evidence from old tidelands, conveyance records, aerial photographs, historic maps, and other archival records. And they were the ones who provided expert testimony in this court case that happens between New Jersey and New York in 1998. And on May 26, 1998, the Supreme Court rules 6-3 in favor of New Jersey, right? Basically saying that yes, that this territory being claimed by New Jersey is technically New Jersey, right? So here's an example, right, of territory being contested by two different states. Okay, we're gonna watch this short video about Hawaii, which, I'm sorry about that, also exemplifies this conflict over territory, right?
I'm in the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Where tourism and the real estate market are booming. But what does that mean for the native population of these islands? And what does that have to do with colonialism?
We've reached this really boiling point where we cannot survive at home anymore.
It's like we're being pushed out of Hawaii. And as a native Hawaiian, I'm very sad for our people. Every day, I think about that.
We realize that America isn't all it's cracked up to be, that they've taken more than they've given to us.
I came here because I often hear people say Puerto Rico is on its way to becoming the next Hawaii. Is that a good thing? I asked native Hawaiians.
Welcome to Hawaii.
Hawaii is very much a part of America.
We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be Americans.
The beauty of Hawaii's beaches is unreal. I had never seen water that shade of blue. So it makes sense that Oahu alone gets more than 4 million tourists a year. But all those tourists have to do is turn around to see the harsh reality of life in Hawaii. People living on the street, many of them Kanaka Maoli or native Hawaiian. The irony is that they can't afford to live on the land that was once stolen from their ancestors.
At the White House yesterday, President Clinton signed a formal letter of apology to the people of Hawaii.
With the Apology Bill of 1993, the United States admitted to illegally overthrowing the government of Hawaii 100 years earlier. Because until the end of the 1800s, Hawaii was an independent nation with its own kingdom led by Queen Liliuokalani. But that was about to change, thanks to missionaries that had come from the United States 7 decades earlier to preach about Jesus. By the 1890s, the descendants of those missionaries had become powerful.
So I just wanted to pause there because there's an important term being used here, nation, right? That Hawaii was a nation, was a sovereign nation before U.S. annexation, right? Before the U.S. claims it as a territory and then later turns it into a state, right? And that's an important point because in this instance, right, Hawaii, while there were already immigrants in Hawaii, for example, from arriving, actually, I don't know the exact dates, but you have already immigrants arriving in the 19th century from Portugal, from the Philippines, from China, Japan, etc. But Hawaii as a nation was, you could argue, a nation because it was represented by one specific group of people, in this case, the Hawaiians, right, who spoke Hawaiian language, who had a Hawaiian culture. So I just wanted to lay that out. They already had been in contact with Europeans, particularly with the British, right? And also Americans, right? And there's already some, like I said, international immigration to Hawaii. But Hawaii as a state is represented by a pretty uniform group of people, in this case, who consider themselves Hawaiians, which why this idea of the nation, a nation state, applies here. Okay.
Businessmen who wanted to make more money. They thought they could do so if only they were in charge. So they decided to take down Hawaii's government. And the United States helped them. They sent a military ship, and in 1893 they removed the queen and made Sanford B. Dole the new leader. Now, if the name Dole sounds familiar to you, it's because you've probably seen the brand before. For a few years after the overthrow, the U.S. struggled with what to do with Hawaii. One president called the overthrow an act of war. But then came 1898, and the U.S. went on a power trip with land-hungry leaders who were now going for Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines too. That same year, the U.S. annexed Hawaii.
The United States did not bring Hawaii out of poverty. It did not bring Hawaii into enlightenment. If anything, it crushed one of the most amazing progressive places and indigenous-led nations, on the planet.
The new government effectively banned Hawaiian language in schools. Students were punished for speaking it, and they attempted to erase native Hawaiian culture, turning it into something to be marketed to tourists.
What we've experienced is the loss of our land, the decimation of our language and our culture, being overwhelmed and becoming more and more of a minority in our own ancestral homelands.
By the time Hawaii voted in favor of statehood in 1959, the Kanaka Maoli were already a minority. Another thing that changed after the overthrow was the use of the land. The new territorial government had other plans for the places that were being used for agriculture.
You had fish ponds and these taro patches, and our people farmed. And I think someone got the idea that they could develop it and create hotels. And so they actually condemned our lands. They kicked Hawaiian people off the lands, and they built up Waikiki, and they dredged a huge area called the Alawai Canal.
Today, Waikiki looks like this. For some, it's an image of progress, but poverty among Native Hawaiians is higher than the state average.
If I had a time machine, I wouldn't choose statehood for our people. I'll tell you that. Yeah.
I believe statehood was a good thing. This is 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 2 parking. It's going for $799,000.
Myla Gibson is a realtor in Oahu.
Business is great. I mean, of course, it's like a catch-22 for me because I am Native Hawaiian. And so on one hand, I'm thankful that I get to make a living in the place that I love so much. But at the same time, my heart breaks for people who aren't so lucky.
The median price for a single-family home in Oahu is over $1 million. That's how much this house was selling for in a neighborhood next to Waikiki. It was one of Myla's listings.
Gentrification to me isn't such a terrible thing. There's a neighborhood here called Kaka'ako. It was all just warehouse space and a lot of people sleeping on the street and a lot of illegal activity. So now you've got Howard Hughes that's gentrifying the neighborhood.
Great amenities, walkable, with easy access to a 100-acre beach park.
And of course, you've got delicious restaurants there, and you've got lifestyle, and you've got community. So to me, that's very positive. What I want to see, though, in addition to the gentrification, is something for Native Hawaiians, something for people that are, of a lower income bracket. We have to do something. Otherwise, we're going to see more people on the streets.
About 30 miles from the luxury high-rises, we found a long line of people waiting to get food.
Where's your home?
You're looking at it.
Cindy Yumiyamaka's husband is Native Hawaiian.
I never thought I would end up here.
We got to the point where we couldn't afford to pay the rent any longer because they kept adding and adding and adding, and it just... there was no place for us to go.
Hawaii is currently the most expensive state to live in the U.S. Some Native Hawaiians have opted for moving away in search of a more affordable life. Today, there are more Native Hawaiians living in the continental U.S. than in Hawaii.
I have a lot of my family moved to the mainland already, and I don't want to go there. I want to stay here. This is my home.
For some of those who stay, food drives like this one can be life-saving.
It helps a lot. If not, you'll never see vegetables on their table or fruit.
America.
Nice to meet you.
This is the lifeline, and that lifeline was broken in the name of development and all that.
100 years after taro patches like the ones in Waikiki were destroyed, Hawaii now imports more than 80% of its food. That's why those still fighting for independence are prioritizing farming again.
Aloha, my name is Pu'uhonua Dennis Bumpy. I'm the head of state of the nation of Hawaii.
The nation of Hawaii has its own flag, its own constitution, and rights to this 45-acre piece of land in Waimanalo.
We always say that we exit America here and we enter Hawaii there.
The story of this land goes back to the 90s after the U.S. signed the Apology Bill.
Wanted independence, yeah, not just sovereignty, but independence.
A group of Kanaka Maoli occupied this beach park, demanding freedom from the U.S.
They admit and confess to overthrowing our country, right? You confess to that, and...
Oh, not sure what happened there. But I think I'll leave it there. I think you would understand sort of where this is going, right? So you have a group of Hawaiians now actively contesting U.S. sovereignty over Hawaiian territory, right? And claiming independence. And that's just to exemplify, right, that you have a people who consider themselves a nation, right? Who were occupied, then had their government overthrown, thereby losing their sovereignty, thereby losing their control over their own territory, right? Again, these really important terms on political geography. Again, through in this case, a vote, right, to become a U.S. state. Prior to that, Hawaii was annexed as a United States territory. So similar to the status that Puerto Rico has today, right? Or Guam or the U.S. Virgin Islands. But it becomes a state later on in the same year as Alaska, right? So I believe in 1950. So now you have, right, a group of indigenous Hawaiians challenging that U.S. sovereignty over land, right? And have actually carved out a territory within one of the islands, right? And claimed it as a independent nation. So here again, we're talking about a contest, right? In this case, they're contesting United States sovereignty over certain land, but have effectively won some right to exercise sovereignty over a piece of land, right? And this is all through political action, right? So if I wanted to use a political geographic perspective here, right, I am looking at how the environment, right, how the landscape of Hawaii has changed over time and been impacted, right, by political acts, whether that is political action coming from the states, like so the United States, right, or political action coming from within the territory by people who are challenging internally, right, the sovereignty over territory, right? So that's why I wanted to show you that example. So another really key term, and this is what those Hawaiian people are doing in that territory, is that they're claiming and they're exercising governance, right? So the term governance refers to the mechanism by which a government exercises power. The processes by which governments are selected, scrutinized, and modified, right? So forms of governance include elections, right? Includes how we form a Senate and House of Representatives, right, to pass laws. Governance also refers to the capacity of a government to generate, establish, and apply policy and legal procedures, right? So this is what making legislation, passing legislation, and then enforcing that legislation, right, at the county, town, city, state level, right? Governance is also the relationship between the state, between the economy, and civil society. Again, civil society are non-state actors, right? So most of us, and the regulation of economic regimes and social authority and practice, right? So when we talk about governance, we can talk about immigration governance, for example. So immigration governance would be how a state rules over who can be a citizen and who cannot, who can be a resident and who can't, right? Other forms of governance include regulating, for example, who can get married at what age, and what the laws and rules of marriage are, right? These are all different forms of governance. So in terms of the United States and its specific political geography, right, and politics, the United States is a federal republic, founded on democratic principles. When we say federal, it's because it's a federation. It's made up of multiple states, right? The U.S. government consists of three branches: the executive, which is the president or the White House, right? Legislative, which is the branches of the Senate and House, right? And judicial, when we're talking about the Supreme Courts and then the lower courts, right? All of these collaborate, work together, right, to pass laws, to approve laws, and then to enforce the laws of the land, right? The sovereign authority is the people, so me and you, us, right? And it exercises that authority through voting, through participation in local politics, engagement in civil society, and of course, paying taxes. Now, the political authority is divided between autonomous sets of governments. So one national being the federal government, right, that rules from Washington, D.C., from the White House, right, from Congress and from the courts, and the others at lower levels like state, county, city, and town, right? So we have different governments at each of those scales. This is a video on electoral politics, and to explain a little bit, right, how electoral politics work in the United States using the example of Michigan.
These 18 states, along with Washington, D.C., for a long time were known as the Blue Wall. And we called it that because starting in 1992, each one of those places voted for a Democrat for president again and again and again. Well, actually,
the Blue Wall, right?
In 2016, Donald Trump won by breaking the Blue Wall.
We didn't break it, we shattered that sucker.
And the way he shattered that sucker is that he won 3 Blue Wall states: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and just barely, and in maybe the biggest surprise, Michigan.
Michigan, a state that was supposed to be a lock for Hillary Clinton.
Michigan has been blue for a long time.
Michigan, isn't that one of the pillars of the infamous Blue Wall?
But here's something that people missed about Blue Wall, Michigan. Even though Michigan had consistently voted for Democrats for president over the years, it wasn't as blue as it looked. By 2016, Michigan already had a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, and it had been that way for some time. During the 2010s, that Republican state government had undermined unions,
so-called right-to-work legislation,
restricted abortion,
the bill is passed,
loosened environmental protections,
controversy surrounding this oil refinery.
So Trump winning Michigan didn't really come out of nowhere. But then, in 2018, Michigan elected a Democrat as governor. In 2020, it voted for Joe Biden over Trump. And in 2022, in a midterm election that was expected to be a red wave, Democrats won every elected branch of Michigan's state government for the first time in 40 years. So now Michigan was blue. Again, I guess. And its new blue government got to work fast, repealing some of the Republicans' signature legislation.
The first state to repeal a right-to-work law in decades.
Expanding anti-discrimination laws.
The bill is passed.
And pouring money into the state's transition to clean energy.
Michigan, a national leader in the fight against climate change.
In this video, we're going to ask why Michigan went so red and then so blue. What do political scientists say? What does the data say? Because maybe Michigan is just a swing state, and this is what it looks like when a swing state swings. But the forces pushing these swings tell us a lot about the U.S. right now, and about our next election. So let's go back to this timeline of big Michigan elections, and we'll start here. In 2008, Michigan voted for Barack Obama for president and for a Democratic state House of Representatives. But the next election would turn out differently.
2010 is really a response to 2008. We see a blowback to Obama's national policies.
In 2010, Republicans won control of the whole state. The reason that matters is because the next year, 2011, was a redistricting year, which means Michigan Republicans were in charge of redrawing these maps of the state's political districts, maps that can favor one party or another depending on which voters they draw into which districts. The new maps they drew looked like this. And as you can see, well, it's kind of hard to tell, actually.
If you just sort of look at the map, it doesn't look too gerrymandered.
But once those maps took effect in the 2012 election, the impact was clear. Let's just look at these, the State House of Representatives districts. If you added up the votes across all of these districts in 2012, Republicans only won about 46% of that vote, but they ended up with 59 out of 110 seats, which was a majority. Meaning they had successfully skewed this map in their favor. And for the rest of the decade, Michigan Republicans actually never won a majority of the statewide vote for the House of Representatives, but they always won a majority of its seats, which kind of tells us something about this whole period.
Redistricting explains the whole thing. If not for the Republican complete control of redistricting in 2012, Michigan would look a lot different. Throughout that whole decade and even into today.
So Michigan wasn't as red as it looked either. But redistricting doesn't actually explain everything. For example, 2016, which is when Michigan, the whole state, broke the blue wall. So what was going on there? This chart looks at how close the vote was in every state in the 2016 presidential election. And Michigan is all the way at the end over here, the closest state in 2016, voting for Trump by a margin of 0.23%.
When it's such a close margin, right, we could find a dozen different reasons.
That's true. A lot of factors here. Let's just start with one or two of them. This is a map of all the counties in Michigan. There are 83 of them, and on the map, a lot of them are geographically the same size. But if you were to resize each county according to how many voters there are in each one, that would look more like this. As you might be able to tell, these 3 counties alone make up a huge part of the state's population, so the way that they vote matters a ton. So let's start here in Macomb County.
Macomb County, just north of Detroit.
Traditionally Democratic, overwhelmingly white.
Historically home to auto workers, union members.
Between 2000 and 2010, half of the manufacturing jobs in Macomb vanished.
Demographically, Macomb is very
white working class. Before 2016, Macomb was a bellwether.
A bellwether, meaning it voted kind of like the rest of the country. So this chart shows how Macomb County voted for president in the years before 2016. These are years it voted for the Democrat for president. This is when it voted for the Republican, and the height is the margin of victory. And now let's do the thing where we add how the whole U.S. voted each year. And notice how closely Macomb always matches the country as a whole, a bellwether, until 2016.
2016 changes all that, and it can come down to one word, and that's Trump.
God bless you, Michigan. God bless you.
He just shifts things dramatically in Macomb County, focused on trade, manufacturing.
Michigan has lost 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs.
This area is a manufacturing area. A lot of people are affected by losing their jobs.
We will stop the jobs from leaving Michigan.
Job creation, not doing all our jobs offshore.
We're going to bring a lot of industry back to our country.
The opportunity to earn a living and take care of our families, put us all to work.
Talking about car jobs is one way that Trump takes Macomb from this to this. But it's not the only way.
We're seeing Trump stoke racial resentment, which is in Macomb always been sort of, unfortunate to say, popular.
Look at the city of Detroit. Nearly half of Detroit residents do not work.
Okay, that's not true, incidentally, unless your data includes children and the elderly. But while we're here, let's talk about Detroit, which is right next door to Macomb County in Wayne County. The city of Detroit is about 78% black, and it typically votes between 93% and 98% Democratic. And in a place with such consistent voting patterns, it really helps to look at turnout.
Politically speaking, when Detroit shows up, it's hard for Republicans to be able to win the state.
This chart shows how many people voted in Detroit in different elections over the years. You can see that turnout in presidential elections is typically higher than turnout in midterm elections. That's true pretty much everywhere. But look at the turnout in 2016. It's almost as low as, for example, the midterm election of 2006. Now, two things are happening here. Detroit is getting smaller during this time. Its population is shrinking, so fewer voters. But Trump had a role here, too.
Look how much African American communities have suffered under Democratic control.
The thing that I think Trump did effectively as far as interacting with African American voters is not getting them to become Republicans or switch their vote to the Republican Party. It's to get them to not be comfortable voting for anyone.
America must reject the bigotry of Hillary Clinton, who sees communities of color only as votes, not as human beings.
Republicans don't have to move the needle that much in those communities to have an incredible impact on election outcomes.
I'm not convinced African Americans like Hillary Rodham Clinton as much as they liked Barack Obama.
No one in this race on either side has that same pull.
If you don't like either side, maybe you don't vote. Now, there are, of course, other factors, too. That outcome is just one more of many that take us from blue Michigan to red Michigan. But remember, after 2016 is when Michigan starts to swing back. In 2018, the state elected a Democratic governor by a big margin. In 2020, it voted for Biden. And to see how we got there, we have to talk about white women. This chart comes from exit polls of white women in Michigan over 10 years of presidential and gubernatorial elections. And it shows us in the early 2010s, including 2016, white women in Michigan were voting more for Republicans.
In 2016, white women across urban, rural, suburban, educational level gave Trump a chance.
But after 2016, something changes. A big swing among that demographic towards Democrats. Now, this chart doesn't tell us the reason for that, but there was something big happening around that time. A kind of adjustment in the way that many women in the U.S. were participating in politics.
We will not be ignored!
millions of people around the world marching for women's rights today.
One part of Michigan was particularly energized during this period.
The largest of all was in Washington, D.C.
Everywhere we turned, we ran into somebody from Michigan.
I'm from Huntington Woods, Michigan.
Waterford, Michigan.
Franklin. We're from Ferndale.
Huntington Woods, Waterford, Franklin, Ferndale. All in Oakland County. Women, especially white women in places like Oakland, were a big part of what drove the Democrats to their victory in 2018 and led to Trump losing the state in 2020.
I didn't think I'd ever have to worry about whether or not the President of the United States was a good role model, and I do now.
I spent every day from 2016 through now making sure I did everything that I could to make sure he's not reelected.
In some ways, Oakland is the mirror image, or maybe a 180 from Macomb County.
Oakland is the wealthiest county in Michigan and the second most well-educated. And at one time, those things made Oakland a very Republican county. But those types of voters, wealthy, well-educated, they vote differently than they once did. And you see that in exit polls, too. This one shows how college-educated voters across Michigan have voted over the past few elections. They've been trending heavily towards Democrats. You can really see the backlash to Trump in the raw voter turnout numbers in Oakland County. Turnout in 2016 was kind of unremarkable, basically in line with earlier years, but look at how many people voted in the first election after Trump won, the midterm election of 2018. Almost as many as in a presidential election. And the 2020 count was unprecedented. Okay, we finally made it to 2022. Democrats win it all. Okay, except, sorry, one more thing.
Proposal 2, the anti-gerrymandering proposal.
The state overwhelmingly passed Proposal 2.
In 2018, by a big margin, Michigan voters approved an anti-gerrymandering measure that took redistricting out of the hands of the legislature and gave it to an independent commission. Over the next 3 years, that commission would replace these maps with new maps. And the first year that these maps would be in effect was 2022. In 2022, if you added up all the elections for Michigan state representatives, Democrats won 51% of that vote. And under the new district lines, they won 56 out of 110 seats, which is 51%.
Michigan's Independent Redistricting Commission gave Michigan Democrats the opportunity to finally have maps that weren't overly biased to Republicans.
Redistricting unlocks a big part of how this happened, but there was more going on here. To really understand 2022, we have to look at these two stories. One started with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in June of 2022. In Michigan, activists responded to that by putting Proposal 3 on the ballot that year, a measure that would enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution. The measure was really popular and passed easily by more than 10 percentage points. The other big thing was something happening in the Michigan Republican Party.
By the time 2022 gets around, the Trump wing of the Republican Party had taken over entirely.
These are photos from a Stop the Steal protest at the Michigan State Capitol just after the 2020 election. By May of 2022, a poll found that a majority of Michigan Republicans supported overturning the 2020 presidential election. Among Michigan voters as a whole, though, only around a quarter agreed with that. But Republicans running for statewide office in 2022 largely endorsed that idea.
How many of you believe that the widespread election fraud was enough to swing the election toward Biden? Raise your hand with me.
That is Tudor Dixon, who Michigan Republicans nominated for governor in 2022.
The city of Detroit has been plagued with election corruption for years.
And that is Kristina Karamo, the Republican who ran to be in charge of Michigan's elections. Both Dixon and Karamo would lose to Democrats by more than 10 percentage points. One place you could really see the reaction to abortion rights on the ballot and to the Republican focus on election fraud was the Michigan suburbs, which exit polls tell us had historically voted Republican until 2022. And the next year, Michigan Republicans met at their convention and they chose Kristina Karamo as their new party leader.
We need to fight to secure our elections. It's the reason I did not concede after the 2022 election.
It's almost like that's all you hear from them.
It's tempting to think that Michigan is just a blue state now, but it won't take much to make it swing back. For example, Michigan is about 3% Middle Eastern North African. Doesn't sound like much, but that actually makes it the most Arab American state in the country by far, and that would be worth paying attention to if, for example, something were to happen that made Arab American support for Joe Biden go way down.
President Biden shows unwavering support for Israel, with the civilian death toll in Gaza rising.
I did vote for Joe Biden in 2020.
Do you plan to vote for him in 2024?
I do not.
Still, if we look back at some of the big moments in this story, you might notice two things. First, it's Donald Trump who's actually been the main character in Michigan politics, going back almost a decade now. And second, you probably saw some of these things happen outside of Michigan, too. This chart shows how every state voted in the most recent presidential election, 2020. If you put how the whole U.S. voted onto this chart, it would go here. And here is Michigan. In other words, by at least one measure, Michigan is the state closest to the country as a whole. Redistricting battles like Michigan's are happening all over the country. National exit polls show that college-educated Americans everywhere have been voting more Democratic, just like in Michigan, and that non-college educated Americans are doing the opposite.
That's pretty indicative of where the parties are headed. I do think that you're seeing party coalitions shift.
There's also evidence that the overturning of Roe v. Wade has been a powerful motivator everywhere, not just in Michigan, with voters rejecting abortion bans in surprising places like Kentucky, Montana, Kansas, Ohio. So, Michigan can make or break a whole national election. But there's a better reason for Americans to be watching Michigan really closely. And it's that when we do, we're looking at ourselves.
Okay, so I'm sorry and I apologize. The video was a little bit long, but I thought it was important to watch the whole way through, in part because one interesting event that happens after this video is actually that Donald Trump does in fact win Michigan in 2024, right, by about 100,000 more votes, and so. The point of the video, or the point of me showing you the video, and particularly around political geography, is to show the importance of drawing maps, right? And in this case, the importance of redistricting, and how redistricting and drawing up these different voting maps or election maps, right, can shape one election to the next. Now, if you were to look at a map of ballots counted for the 2024 election for the state of Michigan, you would quickly see that the majority of rural counties, right, or smaller counties with smaller populations, overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump, while the counties with larger populations in urban areas like Detroit, Grand Rapids, right, overwhelmingly voted for Democrats, right? And this has been a pattern throughout much of the last 2 decades of elections in the United States, right? Smaller rural counties have tended to vote Republican, while urban, larger population or greater population density counties have tended to vote Democrat. However, right, when you add up total numbers, if there's a low turnout, which was clearly much of the case for urban areas in Michigan, right, as represented in this video, but also in this last 2024 election, you'll see that whether a district has more population or not is not in the end that important if voter turnout is low and remains low, right? So there are political decisions involved, right? There's legislation involved in how these districts get drawn, right? Elections are managed through policy, through political decision making, right? And these maps are the effect of basically political geography, right? So I'm going to leave this lecture here because this is kind of a long one. This is part 1, right, of political geography. I think I'm going to save part 2 for when we meet in person in November. And thank you for your attention. I hope you'll find this content useful, and you'll apply some of this idea, right, of political geography, this notion of how policy impacts the spatial order, but also how spatial order impacts policy in the research that you are doing, because you will see that for the almost nearly every event that happens in a place has either political origins or political repercussions. All right. And when we say politics, remember again, we're talking about how we organize society and how we govern society, right? All right. Thank you and take care and see you soon.